Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Maisha Reza, and I am the chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association and a trustee of the 100 Million Campaign. Welcome to this virtual side event around the United Nations General Assembly, jointly organized by the world's largest representative youth organizations. This side event is called Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, and together we will be looking at the impact of the world's incredibly unequal response to COVID-19 these last 6 months, where those who need the most help have received the least. A summit was held 2 weeks ago by laureates and leaders for children, and they released a new report which showed the shocking truth about the global COVID-19 response, where out of $8 trillion, just 0.13% had been dedicated to multilateral appeals. Following the summit, the 100 Million Campaign convened a global meeting for youth activists to discuss how they wanted to use the information from the Fair Share for Children report. Frankly speaking, we are angry because we are on the ground seeing the devastating impact of the incredibly unfair global response, and we know just how much difference a more equal COVID response could have made. We decided to organize this event to call for justice for the most marginalized and to share the truth about what has been going on. In the next hour or so, we will be hearing from youth activists from a dozen different countries, from Brazil to Brussels and from Pakistan to Malawi. These young leaders will share the reality for marginalized children during this crisis. We will also hear from a Nobel laureate and from the president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. For those of you posting on social media, please use the hashtag #FairShareForChildren and Justice for Every Child. I would like to start by introducing my good friend and fellow activist, Peter Kwasi Kodje, the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union, who represents over 30 million students in Africa. Peter was a part of the group who came up with the Fair Share concept and presented the idea to Nobel laureates back in May. Since then, the concept has been growing from strength to strength, and I can think of no better person to explain why we must have a fair share for marginalized children and their families. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maisha, for the generous introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to join young people from all over the world at this virtual event on the sidelines of the ongoing UN General Assembly. Over the last few months, we have seen in horror the shocking experiences of our brothers and sisters who are not as privileged as we are to live we have come to call a normal. At the beginning of the year, when the WHO declared the COVID-19 as a global pandemic, young people from the various regions in the world acting under the convening power of the 100 million campaign for the meeting to discuss the dire situation of our marginalized brothers and sisters due to the combined impacts of the COVID-19. Through our work at the grassroots level, we realized that the pandemic did not affect all of us in the same ways. Among other upsetting experiences, our work showed that marginalized children who received their only source of daily meal from school could no longer have that one meal due to school closures. We also realized, sadly, that children who lived in slums had no option to isolate even if they wanted to. Even worse was the fact that our analysis proved that most children, especially girls, would never return to the classroom even when the pandemic is over. As young people, we could not sit back and look on and do nothing as the pandemic continued to wreak havoc. And so we did what the people with conscience would do. We resolved to demand justice for every child. Since April, supported by the Nobel Prize laureates and leaders and an increasing number of partners, we have been strongly appealing to world leaders from all over the world to commit a fair share of the funds allocated to the coronavirus recovery to support the needs of 20% of the most marginalized, excluded children and their families. Through our studies, we have come to realize that this fair share we're demanding would be able to pay for the combined total of the health, education, water, and sanitation SDGs. It would also be able to provide a global social protection fund. It could support the cancellation of 2 years of debt repayment and support a global vaccination program. By our estimation, the world would save over 70 million lives and would be a fitting response from humanity to this particular crisis. And yet, as we speak today, even though the world has announced trillion in a global response, which by our calculation is more than enough to support and protect everyone who has been affected by the crisis. Sadly, the money has not gone to the most persons in need. It has actually been spent on companies and people from the richest countries. The pandemic, as we know it, is an act of nature, but the millions of children who would be forced out of school into child labor and the millions more that would starve will not be because of the virus, but the unequal and unjust response that will be to blame. And whilst leaders in elected positions are directly responsible or accountable for handling this crisis, we do know that young people more than ever have a moral obligation to stand up and demand accountability for those who cannot ask for it. If we sit and do nothing, we're no different from collaborators of this injustice that is ongoing. On behalf of myself, on behalf of my colleagues in the 100 million campaign, I'm asking decision makers, organizations, and every young person from all over the world to join us to demand justice for every child and for a global COVID response that includes everyone and even the most vulnerable. I want to thank you very much, and we're happy that you've been able to join us for this particular event. Thank you very much. Maisha, back to you.
Thank you, Peter. That is a truly inspiring speech, and the details of them are really shocking. We have seen lots of talk from world leaders yesterday, but so far, very little action. As more countries move back into lockdowns, with others still battling the first wave, it is essential to build an understanding of just how unequal the response has been and to correct it before it is too late. We have heard over and over again, as Peter mentioned, that world leaders say that they're running out of funds to continue helping the marginalized members in our countries. But we do not seem to find shortage of funds when it comes to bailing out big multinational companies that are disproportionately less affected by this pandemic. How humanity responds collectively to the crisis today will determine the future that we build for our children and the future of our people and our planet. The world's unjust economic response to COVID-19 will deepen global inequality for at least a generation. The most marginalized and vulnerable have been left to fend for themselves, and millions of children will pay the price with their lives unless we act now. Young people and students are at a crossroad between fulfilling their economic potential in the long run through education and between contributing to their family's sustenance and basic survival. This is an extremely unfair choice that they are having to make for the poor decisions of world leaders. We need leaders to act in partnership with students, young people, NGOs, and nonprofit organizations, because young people are no longer just demanding resources and support from governments and leaders. We are ready to work with you as partners to ensure that we do not lose a generation due to poor government decisions. During the UN's 75th anniversary, the world must back up its claims of multilateralism and universal rights and ensure that the most marginalized children are protected through and beyond this crisis. We need you to make bold and unconventional commitments, moving away from popular decisions to allocating sufficient resources to the most vulnerable children and families. Not only with cash handouts, which are short-term solutions, but to couple it with solutions to tackle multiple forms of deprivation, such as improved access to healthcare and free quality public education. I'd next like to pass you over to Sebastian, the Vice President of the European Students' Union, another key partner and trustee of the 100 Million campaign, who will take us through this next session.
Thank you, Maisha and Peter. I'm pleased to be joining you all today and to help deliver a loud and clear message to world leaders that their unequal response to COVID-19 has not been good enough. I will be speaking about ESO's perspective a little later on, but for now it's my pleasure to introduce two incredible champions for children's rights who have both supported youth activism for decades. Firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce Kailash Satyarthi. Kailash has achieved so many incredible things, changing the Indian constitution to enshrine the right to education, a global march against child labor that covered over 100 countries and 80,000 kilometers, and directly led to the ratification of the ILO Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor, the only universally ratified ILO convention. He also founded the Global Campaign for Education and is now working with youth organizations through the 100 Billion campaign. Kailash will be speaking on why he's supporting a fair share for children. Kailash, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's amazing to see so many young people come together and speaking on behalf of the most marginalized children of the world. It's a clarion call to those leaders who are having several meetings under the United Nations ongoing events, but we hardly see these most powerful, moral, and compelling voices as I'm listening from Peter, Maisa, Sebastian, you, Amal is going to speak. You are my heroes. And all those who are fighting for the rights and life and freedom and education and dignity of millions of children in this pandemic time are the real heroes. As I said before, this ongoing crisis is not simply a health crisis or economic crisis. It's a crisis of morality. It's a crisis of justice. It's a crisis of childhood. It's a crisis of future. And that cannot be simply ignored. Many of us were hoping that this common pain and suffering will teach us some lessons, some sense of mutual responsibility and shared responsibility. But contrary to it, we are seeing that the ongoing injustices and inequalities and wrongs which we have made in the past are exposed and exacerbated. If this goes on like that, we risk to lose the entire generation. And that is not tolerable. Dear friends, as all of us know, that the Global Response Fund, which is being allocated, which has been already set, but I would repeat that this is so much unjust, unequal, and immoral distribution of COVID response funds. Can you imagine? Who can justify that only 0.13% of $8 trillion being allocated for the most marginalized people through the multilateral mechanisms? And this is not even 1%, not even 0.5%. I am so proud to have you, that the voices are coming for the most important sections of the society, and that is youth. Student unions and youth organizations from all across the world are raising this voice. And we can simply feel, and we can say that we cannot afford to turn the clock back. So much efforts have been put in ending child labor, slavery, trafficking of children, forced labor, illiteracy of children, not by some organizations, but also by the governments and corporations and other sections of society. But the present pandemic and the response from the government is very, very alarming and sometimes frightening. Dear friends, early this month on 9th and 10th of September, when 40 Nobel laureates and world leaders joined the Laureates and Leaders Summit, we have come with a very clear demand and call that 20% of COVID-19 response fund should go to the most marginalized children and their families. That is the least one can think and one can do to save the generation. Dear friends, I'm reminded of my daughter, Devli, who has attended a similar side event back in year 2000, the United Nations General Assembly side event. And when she raised a question, what are you doing for the most marginalized children? Everybody was in shock. The girl was rescued. She was 6 years when she was rescued from slavery, but she had a determination after some rehabilitation and education that she is not going to leave any child behind. She will make sure that every child is free from child labor and goes to school. She met her commitment. And that's why she had the moral courage to question the world leaders that if I can do this much, what can you do, or how can't you do for children like us? And that time, almost 200 million children were working as child laborers. And the response was immediate. The leaders felt ashamed. Some leaders were very compassionate and moved. And on the spot, $450 million were committed for education of the marginalized children. That was the moral voice of Devli. Dear friends, I'm asking a simple question. Whose child was Devli? Who are those 11 million children who may fall out of school? They may not come back to their classes. Who are those additional 30 million children who may fall into child labor and could be trapped into slavery and trafficking and prostitution and many other worst forms of child labor? Who are those over 1 million additional children who may die before the end of this year? Dear friends, Devli is my child. All children, All those children are our children. We cannot wait. I have been asking again and again that it is possible through the strongest voices of the young people. I am quite sure that youth can mobilize the political will. Youth can hold governments and international community accountable. Youth can mobilize the mass opinion for the fair share of children, for children. And I am so proud that the original call came from 100 million campaigners, and that has been taken by 88 Nobel laureates and world leaders in the joint statement. 20% for the 20% most marginalized children. And we have to build a campaign around it. We cannot simply call it and go back home. We cannot afford to do it. Friends, we need to build a sense of urgency. We have to ignite compassion and globalize it. We need to be angry at this point of time. I was very happy to hear from myself or somebody, Peter or you, Sebastian, said that we are angry. I am angry. And that anger should be transformed into new ideas and new actions, a new campaign. And the most important campaign now is the Fair Share campaign. And that campaign should lead to create a culture of fair share in every aspect of life, in every walk of life. Fair share is a call for justice, it's a call for human dignity, it's a call for saving the future of humankind and the planet. So, dear friends, we are there to make sure that we will build a worldwide campaign for fair share for children. And I count upon you, my dear young friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kailash, for your remarks. It is hard to speak after you, Kailash, but I know our next speaker who just connected is one of the very few who can do it. An inspirational champion that has been fighting for human rights and youth activism for over 40 years. Carrie Kennedy is the president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. She is a member of the Laureates and Leaders for Children Steering Committee and a great believer in speaking truth to power. Carrie, we are extremely grateful you can join us today, and we would love to hear your thoughts about why youth activism is important at this time and what you think we can achieve together.
Thank you so much, and it's always such an incredible honor and pleasure to be with my dear friend Kailash and with all the youth who are involved today. You know, I grew up in a religious family, and in our family, we were taught that every child is a child of God, and each of us is given a gift. And that came to mind to me a few months ago when I was speaking to one of the foremost lawyers, human rights lawyers in Venezuela. And he said he was walking down the street and a woman came up to him and said, "What can I do?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you're a lawyer. You know how to get people out of jail. You know how to work with the government. I'm uneducated. All I am is a dancer." And he said, "You know what? If you're a dancer, dance. If you're a singer, sing. If you're a child, play. Do you have that gift inside? You can create change." And I think that's really the message today, that all of us have this capacity inside to make our communities better and our world more strong. And no one needs that more than children in child labor, children in slavery, children making chocolates and making clothing and picking tomatoes, all for us to consume. So that's really what today is about. And, you know, we must demand that governments take a percentage, a large percentage, 20% of the money that's going to COVID and put it to the people who need it the most. This can't just be rich countries paying for themselves in a way that harms the rest of the world. And I'll just end in this way. I started working in human rights in the 1980s. At that time, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships. Today, there's not one left standing. All of Eastern Europe was under communism. Today, there's not a communist country left in Eastern Europe. All of South Africa was under apartheid. Today, South Africa's had a series of freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. And women's rights was not on the international agenda. Today, women's rights is the CEDAW, which is the Women's Rights Convention, has been ratified by 193 countries. All those changes happened, not because governments wanted them to, governments tried to stop them, and not because big multinational corporations wanted them to. Multinationals tried to stop them, and not because armies wanted them to. Huge armies tried to stop them, but because small groups of determined people harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true. That's what today is about. That's what everybody in this Zoom call is doing. All of us here are determined to help put an end to child slavery, an end to child labor. We all know I have a role today. I'm not going to maybe be the person in the history books who changes the world, but in the confluence of all the events, of all those acts of courage and daring and speaking truth to power, but everyone on this call and all of our friends, we will make a more just and peaceful world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you both to Kailash and Kerry. We are now moving on to the main part of the agenda, and I'm delighted to introduce Winnie Nwandiga, who is a coordination activist at the 100 Million campaign in East Africa, an amazing feminist and youth activist. Winnie, the floor is yours. Seems like Winnie has problems with unmuting. Winnie, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. We're going to have an interesting session right now called Youth Blast Session. So welcome to the Youth Blast Session. We have got some amazing speakers, lined up for you in the next 40 minutes. So in the next 40 minutes, we are going to run around the world because we've had speakers from Maisha to Peter to our eldest campaigners. Now we are going to our youth leaders across the world to hear a quick snapshot, on the impact that the COVID-19 has been having on those who are already vulnerable before the crisis, and right now who have sadly received no support, as the $8 trillion has been spent on businesses and people in richer countries. And Maisha has even emphasized on this before. So I'm going to run this session in a very strict way. Our young panelists, our youth activists that are coming, I make no apologies for this, as you want to hear from, all of you amazing speakers. And the only way this can happen is if we stick to time. So I will let all of the speakers know when it is, time for their last line. So once I say last line, your 3 minutes is almost over. So kindly bear with us so that we can get to work within the 40 minutes that we have. So on to our first speaker. Firstly, we will hear from Omondi Eric. He is the Executive Director of Alliance for Sustainable Health and Wealth in Africa in Busia. This is in Uganda. The organization works with young mothers and marginalized members of the community. They teach them about the power of their voices and how they can engage decision makers to be able to make change for those with unequal access to health and education. So Omondi will explain the current reality for rural children and adolescents in Uganda. Only for the next 3 minutes, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I'm deeply honored to be sharing my story on how the impact of COVID-19 has affected rural children and adolescents here in my community. To begin with, my name is Eric Mondi. As Winnie has shared, I'm a youth activist here in Uganda. I live in the border town of Busia, border Uganda and Kenya. I'm passionate about making a difference in the lives of children and people. And in my today work, I work to support young people and children, amplify their voices to reach decision makers and government authorities who have power to change and policies and practices at local and national levels. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has turned economies and many lives upside down within just a few months. Allow me to bring attention to a 15-year-old young man who just gave birth during the lockdown in my community. She has not been able to access essential services, among others, medical care, food, to be able to support her and her child during this lockdown. This is just one out of 1,000 of cases and reports that we've had all over the world. The quarantine measures have been enacted by all our governments, such as closed schools, restrictions on movements and mass gatherings, and maintaining social distance, have only increased cases of child abuse and exploitation against children and adolescents in my community.
Omondi, your time is almost over. Last slide.
Yeah, thank you. We all know by now that the COVID-19 has quickly changed the context in which children and young people are living, and therefore it's important to have in mind that children are a significant portion of the world's population, and the future is only witness to what is happening today. They are powerful agents of change and therefore should be involved in decision-making processes and have their rights and freedoms respected. To achieve this, we call on our government present at the UN General Assembly to deliver a fair share of children from the Global COVID-19 Recovery Fund to support the most marginalized communities. At the United Nations, we demand that world leaders come together and agree on a global package to help low-income countries so as to support the most marginalized during this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Eric. I have had the privilege of working with our next speaker just these few last months in Kenya. Her name is Ashura Michaels. Ashura is an inspiring individual who is not just helping young people in her community, but is standing up for the rights of deaf and disabled children across the world. She is the speaker currently of the East African Legislative Assembly, the Youth Wing. Ashura is from Nairobi, and she actively advocates for the rights of children with disability across the country. Welcome, Ashura. The floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Winnie. Imagine a world where every child is valued equally. My name is Ashura Michael from Kenya. I became deaf at the age of 4 years old. I grew up in the village, that's Migori County, western part of Kenya. I was so lucky my uncle was a local teacher in a primary school. So I attended the primary school and the secondary school for the deaf. I saw so many girls drop out of school. The reason being, there were not enough resources, early pregnancies, and some of them went through rape. They never got justice because They were oppressed due to the communication barrier. I was very annoyed at that time. I decided, I remember civil activists said in 1958 by Martin Luther King, by the end of the day, we're not going to worry about the silence of our enemies, but for our friends. I decided to advocate for these children so that people can listen. Disabled persons in the world. We are about 15% of the total population. Out of that, 94 million are children with disability. From that, we have 10% children with disability from the developing countries who grow up in poverty because we don't have enough resources. This annoys me even more. With this COVID, it has added more anger, affecting children with disability who cannot affect education because parents don't give them priority. They give priority to the other able-bodied children just because the resources are not enough. Now, I want to demand from our leaders, if you want to achieve the SDG one, we cannot achieve if we leave persons with disability behind. I'm not asking, but I demand from the leaders. 15% of the humanitarian fund should support children with disabilities. Let's have fair share for children with disabilities. The time is now. We cannot change tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashura. You're such an inspiration, and thank you for, continuing to amplify the rights of children and young people with disability, and even going over and above to work with young people at large. Our next speaker is Manahil Nazir Ahmed. She's from Pakistan. Manahil has engaged government ministers directly and shown how a committed activist can engage decision makers. Manahil has been working with the 100 million campaign for the last 2 years and has spoken out for the rights of Roma traveling communities. And she will update more over the next 3 minutes. Over to you, Manahil. 3 minutes, strictly.
Hello everyone. I am Manahil from Pakistan, Lahore. And currently I am a student bachelor's in arts. Along with my study, I am also working as a social activist and basically work on marginalized traveling community. I become a youth activist because of my father's work on child rights, and my father enormous inspiration to me. When I saw my father work on the marginalized traveling community, these people have no shelter, proper place to live, here stamped identity that the community moving from one place to another place, living tent house. I shed a light on view problems and struggles. They live without basic human rights like education. They have no shelter and they have lots of health issues. Their children did not get an education. Most of them live in streets and roads and do labor in their childhood. They also face identity issues as they have no registration in government record. They have no ID card, passport, and other source of identity of the country. When I saw the equal division of society, then I thought that I should stand for their right and betterment of these people which live without home shelter, without basic need of life. I went to help them to rise their voice in front of government officials in parliament so that they should do something for their betterment and basic human rights of marginalized traveling community. At the end, using this platform, I would request to a government official that please take immediate steps to prove their lives and would like to say that the government should resolve their identity issues urgent basis so that they obtain their national identity to enjoy equal human rights as other community members enjoy. We are strongly demanding to our government to make special legislation for them and special development plan should make for them in the government budget. The government should pass a law by which they represent in provincial assembly and parliament as well. Under the situation of COVID-19, they are also affected this because they are all didn't know about COVID-19 But in this situation, our organization to help them and tell them how to save with COVID-19 and tell them SOPs. In that community has difficult to manage social distance because they live in tent house, but they are trying to maintain distance. They have no grocery item and
Last
mask
line.
or sanitizer, but our government and our organization has. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Again, I'm sorry for being very strict, but we have to be within time. So our next speaker is Ewell Williams. He has been working in West Point in Liberia, a tough informal settlement in Monrovia. This is in Liberia. He has built up links between marginalized communities and students' unions, led marches to parliament, and founded 100 Million in Liberia. Ewell recently held consultations in West Point to discuss the impact of COVID-19 crisis, particularly on women's rights. Welcome, Ewell.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. And here, I'm Ewell Williams, and I'm from Liberia Youth Activist. Over the period of time, since April 2020, our country has been in a lockdown, and we have like 15 sub-regions in our countries. And mostly, we are from a group like 100 Million campaigners in Liberia. We are helping young people to be free, safe, and educated. And looking at the concentration focus of this campaign, the fair share of children, 20%. So what we told them that to move to people to hear people's stories. And series of donations around the world have been given to the country. And Liberia, we are lacking something global funding on education, not just Liberia as a whole. But you know, the education crisis, this COVID-19 have erupted approximately 1 billion children that are being staying out of school because of COVID-19. Like in West Point, we have over a lot of children that don't have access even to schools. And we notice that the schools don't have materials to even feed up these children. So on this platform, we are using this space to engage with world leaders, other youth ideas, especially for the General Assembly. We want to just point out global funding for education. Let us be very clear, without or adequate funding to the worst education crisis today, this COVID-19, we'll not have children going to schools, even young girls going after to schools. So we need, like, for example, we have technologies, virtual learning today. How many countries can afford that? How many schools have those qualities? We just have 42%, just 42%, and 463 million children do not have virtual technologies to go to school. So I want to take this note to call on world leaders to see education funding as a key impact this COVID-19. As we are highlighting 20% share for the COVID response to the marginalized children, let us also, because every marginalized children will come to the process that it will be educated. They will need to be educated. So if the world has been stuck on education and we build multinational companies and we divide education, our children and young people goes to nowhere. So I just want to highlight a vigorous point on global funding for education worldwide, be it Africa, East Africa, Latin America, is very essential because children are being blocked of the way. Because if you are being marginalized and don't have right to go to school and schools are not teaching you the right things, you are lost. So today I want to take this platform to take the many voices out for education, student leaders, student unions, world activists, that is essential for us to invest into the global funding of education to help like West Africa, East Africa, Latin America. So I just want to stop here and to give the gist that education is important. Every child has the right to be free and educated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ewell. Just on time. I'm now delighted to reintroduce Sebastian. Sebastian has already spoken, but again, he's going to speak again. He is a committed campaigner and the Vice President of the European Students' Union. Sebastian will be talking about his perspective in Europe. And Sebastian, your 3 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Winnie. Colleagues and friends, it's an undoubtable reality that we are living in a disruptive world that is dominated by multidimensional crises. Students as a wider part of society feel the consequences of these global cataclysms in every fire and demand transformation. Global wealth inequalities, climate change, democratic decline, a lack of quality education, gender inequality, racism, anti-Semitism, post-colonial imperialism are dividing our world and humanity at large. COVID-19 and the global north's failure to adequately aid the countries suffering the most has only aggravated the devastating state marginalized communities are finding themselves in today. The pandemic has in a single moment distilled the shortcomings of our leaders and laid bare with tragic consequences the injustice of our society. Democratic governments have been criticized for perceived complacency and incompetence, while authoritarian leaders are seizing the opportunity to exploit the crisis, consolidating their power and crushing dissidents. Our friends and colleagues from the National Union of Students in Belarus fighting against the despicable Lukashenko regime bear testimony of the transformative potential that stems from students organizing themselves. In times like this, students' movements have to fulfill a distinctive role. They have to become spaces where we can safely discuss ideas, workshops through which we can develop progressive politics, and centers of resistance in dark times. They have to be a means of socializing a generation into democratic practice and solidarity. They need to be a way for the marginalized to amplify their voices through collective action as catalysts for a social moment in which we can bring the rest of society with us. Today, with COVID-19 as the defining force shaping our reality and societies across borders, the principle of solidarity acquires a renewed urgency. While the United Nations are celebrating their anniversary in the global north and south, we have been never more divided than now when quantifying solidarity in a fair share for recovery funds. Calling out this injustice and not just accepting the status quo is a political imperative. In the spirit of global students' cooperation with our regional counterparts from around the world, we will not get tired to do so now and in the future. We will continue to stand together and demand a fair share for the most marginalized until justice for every child is served. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Seb. We now have two speakers back to back from India. With 1 in 6 people in the world living in India and an increasing spread of COVID-19, it is important to listen to the impact on marginalized children and their family. So we will hear firstly from Abin Sharma, who's a founding member of the Mukti Caravan, which is working to spread public awareness against injustice, exploitation of children across India, and to help empower young people to advocate for change. And then our next speaker would be Krati Maheshwari, a 100 million activist. Abin will be speaking about rural communities and Krati on the impact of education and health inequalities on marginalized girls. So Abin and Krati, you have 3 minutes. Welcome.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम अरविंद कुमार शर्मा है और मैं बिहार इंडिया का रहने वाला हूं। मैं स्वयं एक बाल मजदूर था। मुझे आदरणीय भाई साहब श्री कैलाश सत्यार्थी जी की संस्था बचपन बचाओ आंदोलन के द्वारा मुक्त कराया गया। बाल दुर्व्यापार और बाल मजदूरी के खिलाफ मुक्ति कारवां जन जागरूकता अभियान, जो कि पूरे भारत में चलाया जा रहा है और अभी 50 सर्वाइवर लीडर के साथ मैं इस अभियान को लीड कर रहा हूं। यह अभियान बिहार में चलाया जा रहा है क्योंकि बिहार में सैकड़ों बच्चे जो कि गांव से ट्रैफिकिंग हो रहे हैं और इस अभियान को 50 सर्वाइवर लीडर बाल दुर्व्यापार और बाल मजदूरी का शिकार कोई भी बच्चा ना हो, इसलिए इस अभियान साइकिल अभियान को लेके गांव में जाकर लोगों को जागरूक कर रहे हैं। अभी तक इस अभियान के माध्यम से कोविड-19 में गांव से ट्रैफिक हुए 100 से अधिक बच्चे को मुक्त कराया जा चुका है और 25 से अधिक ट्रैफिकर्स को अरेस्ट कराया गया है। कोरोना महामारी के कारण गांव में गरीबी, असहाय बच्चे शिक्षा से वंचित हैं और वही बच्चे ट्रैफिकिंग और बाल मजदूरी के शिकार होते हैं। मैं दुनिया के सभी लीडर और सरकार से मेरी मांग है कि कोरोना महामारी के दौरान कोई भी बच्चा ट्रैफिकिंग ना हो और इसके बाद भी ना हो। सबसे अधिक गरीब और असहाय बच्चों की शिक्षा के लिए फेयर फॉर चिल्ड्रन सुनिश्चित करें। यह मेरे सभी लीडर्स और सरकार से मांग है। धन्यवाद।
My name is Arvind Kumar Sharma and I am from Bihar, India. I was a child laborer myself. A lot of children used to work with me in the hotel. We had to work day in, day out for 18 hours a day. I was rescued by Nobel Peace Laureate Mr. Kailash Satyarthi's organization Bachpan Bachao Andolan. At present, I am leading the anti-child trafficking campaign with 50 other youth survivor leaders. This public awareness campaign on bicycle is being conducted in Bihar, India, where crores of children get trafficked from the marginalized families in the villages. No child should become a victim of child trafficking and child labor. So me, along with other survivor leaders, go door to door in the villages to make people aware of trafficking through this campaign. In this campaign, all the youth activists campaigning with me are child labor survivors. We go around cycle to trafficking prone villages and make people aware of this social evil. Through this campaign, more than 100 children have been rescued from getting trafficked during COVID-19 pandemic, and more than 25 traffickers have been arrested. Corona pandemic has deprived marginalized children in the villages of education, and the same children are becoming victims of trafficking for cheap labor. I demand and urge from all the leaders and government of the world that no poor family and their children should fall prey to trafficking for cheap labor during and after the pandemic. I urge for a fair share for children for the most marginalized families so that government can ensure that no child is denied education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abind and Kwati. And it is marvelous to see that work put in by campaigners and activists and advocates against child labor, finally getting to, bear some fruits. We have a child laborer who was here, but right now they are advocating for the rights of the other marginalized ones so that they can be, free from child labor and they can be even safe. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Anisha Agarwala, who is a 17-year-old from Mission, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. Anisha has hosted several events in her school and community for 100 million, including letter writing campaigns and film screenings. She will be talking about how COVID-19 has impacted her community in regards to food insecurity and her concern about access to education. Welcome, Anisha.
Thank you. Nearly 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries. This is how many students have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, the largest disruption of education systems in history. The pandemic has and will continue to have substantial effects beyond education as well. Because in addition to educational institutions worldwide closing, children and communities have lost access to essential services and nutritional food resources. The current 135 million people who suffer from food insecurity worldwide is expected to double by the end of 2020. My name is Anisha Agarwala, and I have witnessed and experienced the overwhelming effects of COVID-19 on my community. I am from Mission, Texas, the southernmost city on the US-Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley. As COVID-19 spread throughout my region, within the 4 counties, the rate of cases is nearly twice as high as the rest of Texas. An estimated 55% of my community's residents live in poverty. Many have described COVID-19 as the poor people's pandemic and the pandemic of color. Unfortunately, this holds true, and the high rate of disease is a tip of the iceberg when it comes to challenges children in my community are facing. Food insecurity has left local food pantries struggling to keep up with high demand. After spending hours waiting in line, people are being turned away because the pantries are out of food supplies. For those children who even have the privilege of attending online classes, schools are grappling to provide the electronics for students to virtually attend. The entirety of the situation feels hopeless because Despite initiatives to help the food pantries and to help the schools, the community has been unable to combat COVID-19's effects. And the fact is, my community is one of thousands across the nation suffering this same fate of food insecurity and education disruption. And as children in the United States, a developing nation, are struggling to this extent, the level of crisis in developing nations becomes clearer. For this reason, I'm not here just to speak on the behalf of my local community. I'm here to speak alongside children across the nation and globe who are demanding their rights from world leaders. I'm here to speak on the behalf of the children who no longer have access to education and the children who are worried about having to go to bed hungry. With the world's children this vulnerable and at the risk of losing so much from the pandemic, young people have the right to make demands from our world leaders. We demand that they take action immediately to increase global funding for the poorest countries and to help them survive the pandemic. As children and young people, we are just not statistics of food insecurity and education disruption. We are this world's future, and for that reason, we deserve so much more. Thank you.
Sorry for that. Allow me to bring back Krati, who was not able to speak. Krati is a 100 million activist, and Krati, welcome. Krati,
hello.
Are you
hello.
here?
Yeah. Hello,
welcome.
everybody. Hello, everybody. Good evening. This is Krati Maheshwari from India. Actually, I am by profession architect and acoustician and involved with the NGO Kabira Foundation that is working with Poonam Gupta for a preschool. So as been my whole life, I have been revolved around my professional life. I have seen child practice like everywhere, from mining, manufacturing, the cultural services, construction sites. So it has always pinched inside me to do something, and we ourselves in our society in the century is doing injustice to these kids. So currently I'm working on to make an application named Let's Divert, a kind of prototype to connect JNVs and government schools with child labor statistics, aiming to eliminate child labor and fill those spaces with education and the safe life for the marginalized children. Today, I'll be going to share my experience of schools, UPS Jakira, and under which works under SSA in my district Bareilly, preschool in Noida, who tried to facilitate learning at home. But as we can see, still some marginalized children due to house chores, forced work, poor environment faces rural-urban gaps. There has been hindrances between the learning, people sitting at home at remote places. Maybe it could be a network issue, internet problem, or not availability of smartphones. And also we can see that 56.5% of students with disabilities, like in my known Manek, Amina, and Rohit, which have hearing impairments, they are struggling, staying away with their own weapons in their life. They are fighting a lot. It's complicated for people with conditions like impairments, autism, and syndromes to understand what physical distances actually means. So people also have, I mean, there are students who have given TC because they have to return back to their villages because of no employment and they cannot afford the prices. So I really doubt there is equality left in our society. Virus COVID-19 doesn't attack the virus of discrimination and inequality, but our society do. So here, I demand here for a fair share of the global funding to distribute sanitary pads to our girls for better health and hygiene, and make provision of smartphones, other digital solutions to all the marginalized children of society. So it would be a equal and inclusive environment. Only thinking inclusively can eliminate this shadowed dark dirt of discrimination in the education sector, winning over the digital divide. I am so thankful to 100 Million Campbell for giving me this opportunity to express my views, and I would really look thankful to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Krati, for highlighting the impact of education and health inequalities on marginalized, children. Our next speaker is Maria Alejandra. Maria is a leader of the events team in 100 Million Peru. They have been working at the community level to be able to provide help to families with little food and challenging decision makers to act to ensure access to food during school closures and domestic violence. As we are all aware, these food programs, and most of them have been able to keep children in school. And now with the pandemic and school closures, these children, are at the margin or are at the center of so much inequalities. And, for Maria Leandra and 100 Million team in Peru to be able to push decision makers to ensure access to food even during school closures is a good thing. Over to you, Leandra.
Thank you so much, Winnie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Alejandra, and I'm here today representing the 100 Million campaign in Peru in defense of children's rights. Yesterday, the Peruvian Ministry of Education announced that more than 230,000 school children have dropped out of their studies this year, the highest dropout rate we've ever encountered. Now, you may wonder why, and the most honest answer I can give you is that for the vast majority of them, education has become a luxury and they simply cannot afford it. Let me give you an example. Earlier this month, Puno's Regional Direction of Education have confirmed that 76% of their school dropouts did it due to economic reasons. It has been reported that these kids and young teenagers are leaving their homes to work in the mines, probably for less than minimum wage and in terrible conditions, in order to provide for their families. These are the kids that had difficulties paying for internet or buying any kind of device that could be used to learn. They are now working to survive, to pay their bills, to feed themselves day by day. And it's not fair for them to carry such a weight on their shoulders at such a young age. Peru's Ministry of Education have failed to provide this basic service to every kid in the country. The most affected population are, once again, the low-income families. While technology is a great tool, the global pandemic has highlighted the great barrier that exists to access it. 100 Million campaign in Peru is going to share these experiences from the point of view of young leaders that live in different parts of our country. We are starting a social media campaign hoping that it would inspire others to tell us more about their stories and what's going on in their communities, and put some pressure on the shoulders of our politicians so they can see our reality and act on it. We called on the nation leaders to avoid cutting funds for humanitarian aid programs organized by international organizations on poor and middle-income countries. The positive impact these programs have on them is what many families need to survive the pandemic. You have the power to change their life. You have the power to make these kids go back home and just be kids. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, together with the team in Peru, what you're doing to make Peru and by and large the world a better place. Our next speaker is Medna Saran. Medna is also from the US and is a high school student in Virginia who founded the Touch of Life Foundation in 2016 to organize drives for books, clothes, and funds while also engaging their local elected officials on the issue of child labor. She has since engaged with the 100 Million campaign to amplify youth voices and continue her activism. Welcome, Medna.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Medna Saran, and I'm speaking from the United States as an activist against human trafficking and forced labor. I am 16 years old, and I live in Virginia, where most of us are fortunate enough to have a proper education, have sufficient food, and have the freedom to be a kid. However, this is not the case for thousands of victims of human trafficking and child labor. When I was 7 years old, my family and I visited the Bal Ashram in India, founded by Mr. Kailash Satyarthi. But to our dismay, we saw children who were forced to work, and many of the children were malnourished, had numerous scars, and looked like they were beaten. I asked my parents why these children had so many scars and why some didn't want to play. They told me in the most age-appropriate way. These children were forced to work against their will, and if they did not listen, they would get beaten. At that moment, I realized that everyone did not have the same freedom as I had, and I immediately wanted to make a change. One of my biggest inspirations was a young boy who I met at the Bal Ashram, and he was a victim of bonded labor who miraculously escaped and was rescued by BBA. He grew up in the Bal Ashram and prospered. Amarlal is now a successful lawyer who fights for children's rights. His success story shows us that every child has the right to become what they want and what they dream about. After coming back to the United States when I was 8 years old, my brother and I contacted our school administration and organized our first bake sale and raised over $2,000 US, and all of the proceeds went to the rescued victims of forced labor. Eventually, in 2016, my brother Kushan and I created our nonprofit, the Touch of Life Foundation, to advocate and to draw attention to the global issues of forced labor of children and trafficking, and where children are exploited and trafficked against their will, often with false promises to work somewhere else. Since 2016, we have raised over $20,000 US, collected over 1,000 pieces of clothing that went to the rescued victims, and advocated to lawmakers to support certain bills and laws. Furthermore, we created multiple school clubs around the US and held virtual volunteer sessions to educate and advocate against trafficking. However, I have set up this foundation to try and do what I can, but this is still not enough to tackle the issues, and that's why I'm asking the UN missionaries to make good on their promise. We need the EU and the governments of the G7 to enforce that, to enforce the fact that companies in their supply chains are not utilizing trafficked children that have been forced into labor. We need governments to commit to trying to make this change and amending laws to reflect that. My heartfelt desire is that these children will be allowed to be children who are free to grow up and follow their dreams. It is time for developed countries to do something about human trafficking. Incidents of violence and abuse have steeply risen amid the COVID lockdown, and children are not receiving the protection they need from the governments. And we need to make sure these protections are funded. I hope you all are inspired to make a change in your community because every child deserves the basic right of freedom. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Medna, for your powerful remarks. Our next speaker is Edgleison Rodriguez. He is part of the amazing 100 Million Youth Committee in Brazil and has been leading the work to defend adolescents from marginalized communities in Brazil from the very high rates of violence and deaths at the hands of the authorities. Welcome, Rodriguez.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning for all who are watching us. It's a pleasure to be here representing our country and to share a little bit about our contest. I would like to start asking, when will every child have justice? This was the question that we asked last year during the 100 million event in New York, and today we ask again. The most marginalized and vulnerable children and youth in Brazil lives in poor communities, and during this pandemic of COVID-19, they have been affected directly in their lives. They had some support from the government, but it's not enough. It is necessary more investments to support families getting handle this situation. Every kind of violence continues happening during this pandemic situation. For example, every 23 minutes, a Black young have been killed in our communities. Many girls have been victims of sexual exploitation, and thousands of children have worked in the streets. And we need governments who recognize the violence against youth in Brazil and respect the children and adolescent statute. We need to fight against all violence that affect children's lives. And this battle should be a commitment of everybody, civil society, government, companies. Besides that, we need to fight for education and public investments in education, because we know that children in all the world is out of the school or with problems to access online education. And the risk that they will not return to school and will start in child labor is real. We want to ask for more commitment and investment in children's lives. So we ask for a fair division of resources and for the wealthiest to distribute their wealth to the poorest. Is it possible in this context to overcome the challenges? It is possible. We need to act to guarantee the protection of thousands of children and adolescents against child labor and against so many other human rights violations. Among the possible paths It's essential that countries and decision makers defend and press for more investments in public education. Defend the implementation of public policies of basic income for families, social protection, health, and education for all, and it's essential that all programs, actions, and public policies, the integral protection of children and adolescents be a respected principle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right on time, Rodriguez. And also thank you for the work you're doing. It has also been an issue in many parts of Africa where we have young people, especially from the inner cities, really dying, at the hands of authorities. So thank you so much for the work you're doing in Brazil to ensure that our young population, our leaders of today and tomorrow are safe. Our last speaker for this session today is Leandra Phiri. Leandra is from Malawi. She will be speaking about the challenges facing marginalized communities in Malawi because of the world's unequal response to COVID-19. Welcome, Leandra.
Thank you, Winnie. Hello, everyone listening. I'm Leandra Phiri, an exchange participant at Youth Alive Kenya for NOREC and youth researcher for Restless Development Uganda, and I'm from Malawi. I became interested in advocating for justice for young people in education back in 2018. I was so privileged to attend quite a nice school with enough resources and equipment. And to me, quality education has not only been what I learned in school, but learning in a conducive environment with well-equipped resource centers and even well-trained tutors. One day, I became so curious to know more about the young people I saw every day in my community, walking barefooted to their school. I was so heartbroken to see children from Mulunguzi Primary School in Malawi being roasted in the sun for the sake of grasping knowledge from their tutor. So I sat back and I think to myself, this means when it's rainy, there is no school, no education, no future, and yet a failed nation. So I took interest in these young people and decided to take a step for change because I know that the spark of justice to children and youth's education is not completely extinguished, but if given enough resources with love and care for a future generation, it can grow tremendously. Since the beginning of this year, I have enjoyed living in Kenya up until the COVID-19 pandemic thrust. Do you know that this period has shed more light on the inequalities in access to digital technologies in school? And when I think about those young people at Mulunguzi Primary School, all I know is that a majority of them are not even computer literate and have no access to these technologies to permit them to enjoy their so-called educational rights. Doesn't Malawi's constitution postulate education as a right? Then why is there lack of support services and instability to give children the quality education they need? So I find this platform as a timely reminder to address digital inequality as well as improved infrastructure, not only at Mulunguzi Primary School in Malawi, but all schools that are not spared from this critical challenge. Lack of resources and unwillingness by national governments have proven to be the major challenges in as far as implementation of policies to achieve quality education is concerned. Therefore, on behalf of my fellow youths addressing justice for young people to access quality education, I urge all national governments to mobilize resources and provide equitable access to digital learning to help build the digital gap between poor children and those from middle and upper income backgrounds so that each and every child should enjoy their right to education. I see a future of inclusive and equitable education for all young people if the UN and all world leaders do not cease their efforts to help developing countries like Malawi in mobilizing resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leandra. Well, I promised you I promised you that we're going to hear from some of our brilliant activists, but I just didn't count on just how incredible you all are. Thank you to our activists for highlighting the inequalities that have been so clear, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have one question, and Amar, I will bring you on board so that you can get to interpret the question, because the question was, the question is directed to Abind. So the question is from one of our activists in Uganda, Julius, and this is the question he's asking. Do you think formation and training of child protection committees at village level in every country can help combat child labor? Did you hear me, Amar? Do you think the formation and training, yes. Do you think the formation and training, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, the question is, do you think formation and training of child protection committees at the village level in every country can help combat child labor? Formation and training of child protection committees.
Okay, अरविंद तुम मुझे सुन रहे हो?
जी भैया।
हाय, तुम्हारे लिए एक सवाल है, वो ये है कि हमारा जैसे जो एक प्रोग्राम है, जिस प्रकार से हमारा बाल मित्र ग्राम एक कार्यक्रम है, जिसके अंतर्गत तो हमारा जो कमेटी है, क्या वो इस चीज को, बच्चों की सुरक्षा को मद्देनजर, क्या इस चीज को खत्म कर सकता है, या फिर हमारी जो पंचायतें हैं या फिर जो हमारा काम है वो इसमें महत्वपूर्ण भागीदारी कर सकता है बच्चों की सुरक्षा को लेकर के?
जी बिल्कुल कर सकता है, क्योंकि बच्चों की जो अधिकार है और जो पंचायत लेवल और ग्राम लेवल पे जो होते हैं, जो पंचायत मुखिया होते हैं, अगर वहाँ पे जो हमारा बाल मित्र ग्राम, जैसे हमारा संगठन के द्वारा हर एक गांव में बाल मित्र ग्राम होता है। बाल मित्र ग्राम ऐसा होता है कि वहाँ पे बच्चे अपने अधिकार के बारे में जान सके, उनके साथ किसी भी प्रकार का शोषण हो तो वो अपने अधिकार के लिए लड़ाई लड़ सके, कोई भी बच्चा वहाँ पे बाल मजदूरी ना करे। इस चीज को वहाँ वो सभी बाल पंचायत के सदस्य एक गठन करते हैं, बाल पंचायत मंडल बनाते हैं, और वो अपने जो उनके साथ कोई भी किसी भी प्रकार का शोषण या उनके कम्युनिटी में शोषण होता है किसी भी बच्चे के साथ, तो वो होने नहीं देते हैं। ये हमारा बाल मित्र ग्राम का जो उद्देश्य है, ये यही कहता है कि हर एक गांव, हर एक समाज का बच्चा शिक्षित हो, वो पढ़ने जाए, कोई भी बाल मजदूरी ना करे, और किसी भी प्रकार का शोषण होता है तो वो बच्चे ग्राम लेवल से अपने जो अधिकारी, जो संबंधित व्यक्ति हैं, उनको बता सकते हैं, और हम चाइल्ड लेबर, चाइल्ड ट्रैफिकिंग ऐसे क्राइम को रोक सकते हैं। जी।
Okay, so there is one program, is a child-friendly village, which is running by our organization. So there are a young youth leader in each and every villages who are the responsible for their local problems, whatever kind of the issues they have. So children can raise their voice by themselves, and they can also introduce their problems to the local leader, the government authorities, and they can solve out the problems and they can find the solutions just by themselves. So they are their own decision makers. So, and they can prevent the child labor, child trafficking, and the villages which are the child-friendly village in India, it means that there is no child working in that village, and every girls and boys going to schools.
Thank you so much, Amar. Thank you so much, Abind, for also answering the question. I think one thing that even amazes me at a personal level is the power that we have as young people, especially when we stand together in solidarity and in partnership, for us to be able to, push for change in our different communities, in our different countries, in our different continents, and even, you know, us meeting here together as 100 million, you know, to be able to even share some of these experiences. I know even across the board, we are borrowing best practices that we can be able to implement, you know, in our different communities. Thank you so much, our activists. So when we as individuals, young people, can change, you know, so many lives. Just imagine how different the world would be if governments put their money where their mouth is. And that is, you know, our powerful even topic for this side event. Put your money where your mouth is. And, you know, if they would have just allocated money for the most marginalized, vulnerable young people and children, their fair share of the global response. And, you know, it's so sad that even during the pandemic, our most vulnerable and marginalized still continue to suffer the most. As Peter said, we are going to be paying it back. And we demand that along with the world's richest companies and people, that the most marginalized children and their families receive their fair share of the global COVID response. So Amar, I will now come to you, you know, and I'm delighted to introduce you to be able to give us our closing remarks. You know, allow me to introduce Amar. Amar is a former child laborer, such an inspiring individual, you know, who now works as a lawyer and defends other children who are being exploited. He is a remarkable change maker, no doubt. And, you know, I can't think of any other better person to give us closing remarks. Amar, over to you.
Thanks, Winnie. COVID-19 has been a common challenge to all of humanity, and with our global response, which is only protecting the business and people in richer communities, it is a challenge we are failing. The response by citizens to COVID-19 has been remarkable. Millions of healthcare workers are still risking their lives to save patients, and many millions more people are supporting their neighbors and communities. But this is in stark contrast to the international communities and response to the pandemic, which has been unequal, unjust, and immoral. 8 trillion has been announced with nothing to for those who need help the most. The world has never faced such a common enemy. Yet the global response by our leaders has been to leave the most vulnerable peoples on earth to fend for themselves. The daily laborers who keep food on tables, they provide so much to us, but we have not given them any protection during this crisis. The millions of children living in refugee camps, the 500 million children who cannot read or write, the families who have no bank accounts and little saving, they should be getting more support, not less. Their parents who now cannot feed their children. I know how evil child labor is. When I see the prediction for child labor to actually increasing next year, it is heartbreaking. Number of sexual abuse cases increasing, and children are victims of that offense. Our future is not safe in the present time. When I see trillions of dollars for business, but no help for those families with any food, it makes me despair. I say to the world leaders, shame on you. We will not just condemn them, but we will organize. I urge every single one of you to keep helping people in your community and to join the 100 million campaign's call for justice. Let's work together until we win. Let's do your bit. Your action can make a big change. Your action can save the life of someone. Fair share for children, justice for every child. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amar. And thank you again to all our speakers and all of you for joining us today, and even for my colleagues, for making this possible. This is just the beginning of our call for justice. And this is to everyone out there who'd like to get involved. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed evening. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you so much.